Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the May 2021 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook of Fascism by Clara Zetkin from August 1923. If you like this video, please click the like and the subscribe buttons and consider supporting us on Patreon. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. Okay, so this is an audiobook of Fascism by Clara Zetkin. It is from Labor Monthly from August 1923. Thanks to John Partington, and this file was transcribed and marked up by Enda O'Callaghan for the Marxists Internet Archive at marxists.org. Please go check them out. They have thousands of free Marxist texts online for you to read. And I would just like to call your attention to one thing and emphasize one thing before we get into the text, which is the date, again, of this publication, 1923. I find in my life, I have often thought of fascism as like a relatively brief phenomenon that, of course, met a spectacular end in World War II. However, Italian fascism was around for over 2 decades. I mean, it lasted a while, a significant amount of time. Significant at least, to not be considered a complete flash in the pan. This is, of course, not to discount other far-right governments with fascist characteristics that persisted after World War II and, dynamics similar to such which are still present with us today, because they absolutely are and arguably, in fact, are on the rise. So even though, as far-right people would have you say, oh, the fascists haven't existed for 70 years, blah, blah, blah. These dynamics are what we need to understand, and I think that this is a good document for getting into some of those dynamics. So without further ado, let's get into the text. In fascism, the proletariat is confronted by an extraordinarily dangerous enemy. Fascism is the concentrated expression of the general offensive undertaken by the world bourgeoisie against the proletariat. Its overthrow is therefore an absolute necessity. Nay, it is even a question of the everyday existence and of the bread and butter of every ordinary worker. On these grounds, the whole of the proletariat must concentrate on the fight against fascism. It will be much easier for us to defeat fascism if we clearly and distinctly study its nature. Hitherto, there have been extremely vague ideas upon this subject, not only among the large masses of the workers, but even among the revolutionary vanguard of the proletariat and the communists. Hitherto, fascism has been put on a level with the White Terror of Horthy in Hungary. Quick comment there. White terror, what does that mean? Counter-revolutionary terror, right-wing terror. If red is the color of socialism and revolution, white is the color of counter-revolution, reaction, capitalism, feudalism, other backward elements that are anti-socialist. Okay, continuing. Although the methods of both are similar, in essence they are different. The Horthy terror was established after the victorious, although short-lived, revolution of the proletariat had been suppressed, and was the expression of vengeance of the bourgeoisie. The ringleaders of the White Terror were a quite small clique of former officers. Fascism, on the contrary, viewed objectively, is not the revenge of the bourgeoisie in retaliation for proletarian aggression against the bourgeoisie, but it is a punishment of the proletariat for failing to carry on the revolution begun in Russia. The fascist leaders are not a small and exclusive caste. They extend deeply into wide elements of the population. We have to overcome fascism not only militarily, but also politically and ideologically. The reformists, even today, consider fascism to be nothing else but naked violence, the reaction against the violence begun by the proletariat. To the reformists, the Russian Revolution amounts to the same thing as Mother Eve's biting into the apple in the Garden of Eden. The reformists trace fascism back to the Russian Revolution and its consequences. Nothing else was meant to Otto Bauer at the Unity Congress at Hamburg when he declared that a great share of the blame for fascism rests on the communists, who had weakened the force of the proletariat by continual splits. In saying this, he entirely ignored the fact that the German independents had made their split long before the demoralizing example was given by the Russian Revolution. Contrary to his own views, Bauer, at Hamburg, had to draw the conclusion that the organized violence of fascism must be met by forming defense organizations of the proletariat, because no appeal to democracy can avail against direct violence. At any rate, he went on to explain that he did not mean such weapons as insurrection or a general strike, which did not always lead to success. What he meant was the coordination of parliamentary action with mass action. What was to be the nature of these actions, Otto Bauer did not say, but this is the very point of the question. The only weapon recommended by Bauer for the fight against fascism was the establishment of an International Bureau of Information on World Reaction. The distinguishing feature of this new old international is its faith in the power and permanence of bourgeois domination, and its mistrust and cowardice towards the proletariat as the strongest factor of the world revolution. They are of the opinion that against the invulnerable force of the bourgeoisie, the proletariat can do nothing else but act with moderation and refrain from teasing the tiger of the bourgeoisie. Fascism, with all its forcefulness in the prosecution of its violent deeds, is indeed nothing else but the expression of the disintegration and decay of capitalist economy, and the symptom of the dissolution of the bourgeois state. This is one of its roots. Symptoms of this decay of capitalism were observed even before the war. The war has shattered capitalist economy to its foundation, resulting not only in the colossal impoverishment of the proletariat, but also in deep misery for the petty bourgeoisie, the small peasantry, and the intellectuals. Quick comment, she is of course talking about World War I. All these elements had been promised that the war would bring about an amelioration of their material conditions. But the very opposite has happened. Large numbers of the former middle classes have become proletarians, having entirely lost their economic security. Their ranks were joined by large masses of ex-officers who are now unemployed. It was among these elements that fascism recruited quite a considerable contingent. The manner of its composition is also the reason why fascism in some countries is of an outspoken monarchist character. The second root of fascism lies in the retarding of the world revolution by the treacherous attitude of the reformist leaders. Large numbers of the petty bourgeoisie, including even the middle classes, had discarded their wartime psychology for a certain sympathy with reformist socialism, hoping that the latter would bring about a reformation of society along democratic lines. They were disappointed in their hopes. They can now see that the reformist leaders are in benevolent accord with the bourgeoisie, and the worst of it is that these masses have now lost their faith, not only in the reformist leaders, but in socialism as a whole. These masses of disappointed socialist sympathizers are joined by large circles of the proletariat, of workers who have given up their faith not only in socialism, but also in their own class. Fascism has become a sort of refuge for the politically shelterless. In fairness, it ought to be said that the communists, too, except the Russians, bear part of the blame for the desertion of these elements to the fascist ranks, because our actions at times failed to stir the masses profoundly enough. The obvious aim of the fascists, when gaining support among the various elements of society, must have been, as a matter of course, to try and bridge over the class antagonism in the ranks of their own adherents, and the so-called authoritative state was to serve as a means to this end. Fascism now embraces such elements which may become very dangerous to the bourgeois order. Nevertheless, thus far these elements have been invariably overcome by the reactionary elements. The bourgeoisie had seen the situation clearly from the start. The bourgeoisie wants to reconstruct capitalist economy. Under the present circumstances, reconstruction of bourgeois class domination can be brought about only at the cost of increased exploitation of the proletariat by the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie is quite aware that the soft-speaking reformist socialists are fast losing their hold on the proletariat, and that there will be nothing for the bourgeoisie but to resort to violence against the proletariat. But the means of violence of the bourgeois states are beginning to fail. They therefore need a new organization of violence, and this is offered to them by the hodgepodge conglomeration of fascism. For this reason, the bourgeoisie offers all the force at its command in the service of fascism. Fascism has diverse characteristics in different countries. Nevertheless, it has two distinguishing features in all countries, namely the pretense of a revolutionary program, which is cleverly adapted to the interests and demands of the large masses, and on the other hand, the application of the most brutal violence. Quick comment, I don't mean to disrupt her flow, but that first thing, I've been saying that forever, that is such a key thing. The pretense of a revolutionary program. The way I often phrase this is using radical rhetoric to shore up support for the status quo in one way or another. So they will co-opt socialist, revolutionary, radical language and then spin it into this dark, violent, hateful defense of the status quo as the bourgeoisie seeks to maintain control. And just another quick note, why are we seeing this rise in this in the last decade or so, too? Well, look at 2008. This system is just going to keep getting less and less stable. And the last thing they want is for workers to actually get educated with good socialist, communist, Marxist theory and history, and to form effective resistance and perhaps hopefully even take power. That's the last thing they want. So what they do is they put out these decoys. Fascism is in that sense a decoy. It's something that is there to soak up your outrage and have the pretense of looking revolutionary or radical, but in fact is just going to spin you into a harmful direction where you just get manipulated by the bourgeoisie. I think libertarians do this to a significant extent. They have all this talk about smashing the state, and there's a certain sort of revolutionary energy or veneer there. It's fascist, though, essentially, but in exactly the way that Zetkin is describing here. The more energetic sectors of the MAGA crowd, same exact thing. It's a coalition. You know, you can't look at just one Trumper MAGA person in isolation or just one libertarian in isolation. It's what conversations are they promoting and taking part in? What kind of solutions are they pushing? What kind of consciousness are they pushing, etc.? And you see a convergence from a few different angles of all these kind of right-wing, populist, pseudo-liberating ideologies into what is basically support for capitalism in one way or another. A capitalism that is struggling badly. Make no mistake, these people are anti-socialist. Anti-socialist. They may sound like they share some of your anger. Maybe even they do. But insofar as they are wedded to these right-wing ideologies, they are not your friend. In fact, they think you're the enemy. So, continuing. The classic instance is Italian fascism. Industrial capital in Italy was not strong enough to reconstruct the ruined economy. It was not expected that the state would intervene to increase the power and the material possibilities of the industrial capital of northern Italy. The state was giving all its attention to agrarian capital and to petty financial capital. The heavy industries, which had been artificially boosted during the war, collapsed when the war was over, and a wave of unprecedented unemployment set in. Quick comment, this is what the USA is trying to avoid. If the U.S. military-industrial complex ever stopped for a second, there would be widespread unemployment like you couldn't even believe. I mean, just look at the effect of when an army base closes in some rural area, what it does, the black hole it creates in the economy and social fabric there. I mean, this is why they keep inventing enemies for the U.S. to chase after, because it's just, that is what the entire fucking economy is based on. All right, continuing. The pledges given to the soldiers could not be redeemed. All these circumstances created an extreme revolutionary situation. This revolutionary situation resulted in the summer of 1920 in the occupation of the factories. Upon that occasion, it was shown that the maturity of the revolution makes its first appearance among a small minority of the proletariat. The occupation of the factories was therefore bound to end in a tremendous defeat instead of becoming the starting point for revolutionary development. The reformist leaders of the trade unions acted the part of ignominious traitors, but at the same time it was shown that the proletariat possessed neither the will nor the power to march on towards revolution. Quick comment there. This is what we see Lenin writing about in detail around the Russian Revolution, where the Soviets at that time, in a revolutionary situation, were dominated by the Mensheviks and the social revolutionaries. These were like social democrats and radlibs. And when the time came, they refused to take power. And eventually, the Bolsheviks, even though they were smaller initially, they had to push through because probably there would have been a situation like this as well. Continuing. Notwithstanding the reformist influence, there were forces at work among the proletariat which could become inconvenient to the bourgeoisie. The municipal elections, in which the Social Democrats gained a third of all the councils, were a signal of alarm to the bourgeoisie, who immediately started to seek for a force which could combat the revolutionary proletariat. It was just at that time that Mussolini had gained some importance with Fascismo. After the defeat of the proletariat in the occupation of the factories, the number of the fascisti was over 1,000, and great masses of the proletariat joined the Mussolini organization. On the other hand, large masses of the proletariat had fallen to a state of indifference. The cause of the first success of the fascisti was that it made its start with a revolutionary gesture. Its pretended aim was to fight to retain the revolutionary conquests of the Revolutionary War, and for this reason they demanded a strong state which would be able to protect these revolutionary fruits of victory against the hostile interests of the various classes of society represented by the, quote, old state. Its slogan was directed against all the exploiters and hence also against the bourgeoisie. Fascism at that time was so radical that it even demanded the execution of Giolitti and the dethronement of the Italian dynasty. But Giolitti carefully refrained from using violence against fascism, which seemed to him to be the lesser evil. To satisfy these fascist clamors, he dissolved parliament. At that time, Mussolini was still pretending to be a Republican, and in an interview he declared that the fascist faction could not participate at the opening of the Italian parliament because of the monarchist ceremony accompanying it. These utterances provoked a crisis in the fascist movement, which had been established as a party by a merger of the Mussolini adherents and the representatives of the monarchist organization, and the executive of the new party was made up of an even number of members from both factions. The Fascist Party created a double-edged weapon for the corruption and terrorization of the working class. For the corruption of the working class, the fascist trade unions were created, the so-called corporations in which workers and employers were united. To terrorize the working class, the Fascist Party created the militant squads which had grown out of the punitive expeditions. Here, it must be emphasized again that the tremendous treason of the Italian reformists during the general strike, which was the cause of the terrible defeat of the Italian proletariat, had given direct encouragement to the fascists to capture the state. On the other hand, the mistakes of the Communist Party consisted in their regarding fascism as merely a militia and terrorist movement without any profound social basis. Let us now examine what fascism has done since the conquest of power for the fulfillment of its intended revolutionary program, for the realization of its promise to create a state without class. Fascism held out the promise of a new and better electoral law and of equal suffrage for women. The new suffrage law of Mussolini is in reality the worst restriction of the suffrage law to favor the fascist movement. According to this law, 2/3 of all the seats must be given to the strongest party, and all the other parties together shall hold only 1/3 of the seats. Women's franchise has been nearly entirely eliminated. The right to vote is given only to a small group of propertied women, and the so-called, quote, war-distinguished women. There is no longer any mention made of the promise of the Economic Parliament and National Assembly, nor of the abolition of the Senate, which had been pledged so solemnly by the fascists. The same can be said about the pledges made in the social sphere. The fascists had inscribed on their program the 8-hour day, but the bill introduced by them provides so many exceptions that there is to be no 8-hour day in Italy. Nothing came also of the promised guarantee of wages. The destruction of the trade unions has enabled the employers to effect wage reductions of 20 to 30%, and in some cases of even 50 to 60%. Fascism has promised old age and invalid insurance. In practice, the fascist government, for the sake of economy, has struck off the miserable 50 million lira which had been set aside for this purpose in the budget. The workers were promised the right of technical participation in the administration of the factories. Today, there is a law in Italy which proscribes the factory councils completely. The state enterprises are playing into the hands of private capital. The fascist program had contained a provision for a progressive income tax on capital, which was to some extent to act as a form of expropriation. In fact, the opposite was done. Various taxes on luxuries were abolished, such as the automobile tax, for the pretended reason that it would restrict national production. The indirect taxes were increased for the reason that this would curtail the home consumption and thus improve the possibilities for export. The fascist government also abrogated the law for the compulsory registration of transfers of securities, thus reintroducing the system of bearer bonds and opening the door wide to the tax evader. The schools were handed over to the clergy. Before capturing the state, Mussolini demanded a commission to inquire into war profits, of which 85% were to be restored to the state. When this commission had become uncomfortable for his financial backers, the heavy industrialists, he ordered that the commission should only submit a report to him, and whoever published any of the things that transpired in that commission would be punished with 6 months' imprisonment. Also in military matters, fascism failed to keep its promises. The army was promised to be restricted to territorial defense. In reality, the term of service for the standing army was increased from 8 months to 18, which meant the increase of the armed forces from 250,000 to 350,000. The royal guards were abolished because they were too democratic to suit Mussolini. On the other hand, the carabinieri were increased from 65,000 to 90,000, and all the police troops were doubled. The fascist organizations were transformed into a kind of national militia, which by latest accounts have now reached the number of 500,000. But the social differences have introduced an element of political contrast in the militia, which must lead to the eventual collapse of fascism. Now, quick comment from me before we proceed. I mentioned before a couple of the currents within the U.S. right wing and possible fascist traits that those different movements bear. What I was most reminded of reading that list of, this pattern of sort of progressive promise and then complete failure to deliver, or actually delivering the opposite, I was most reminded of Donald Trump. The promises that the fascist party made here they reached a lot further over to the left in making their promises. That's because Italy was in a revolutionary situation with an actual communist party, etc. Those were the people they were trying to break up, distract, dissolve, etc. Hence, they had to reach into the heart of the communist program, pull out some planks, and basically spread everybody out. Get people pulled over to this side, and then spin them into an organization where nothing would happen. Trump, in this day and age in the United States, we don't have anywhere near as developed a left, so they don't have to make those kind of far-reaching promises. But you see, for example, Trump, just in general, saying he's going to do something for common people, which if anyone has looked at the behavior of the Republican Party for decades now, you would know that that is not likely to happen. But he did, for example, promise some kind of, or at least strongly suggest that he was in favor of and was going to fight for some kind of national health care plan. He said in an interview that he could be considered right-wing on a lot of things, but, one thing he might be left-wing on is like health care. Of course, that didn't happen. Really, the only thing he did was cut taxes for the rich. As that's what all Republicans do. Sorry, but that's reality. I know the smelling salts are unpleasant, but here we are. So anyway, that is what that pattern most reminded me of. is this, oh yeah, we're going to do things for you, blah, 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 and then just pulling them back. And again, I submit that the main difference between now and then is our left isn't as organized, so they don't have to work as hard. You know, the asks of the left are so feeble. And in fact, our strength in organization currently, I mean, I'm hoping that over the next 5 to 10 years, we're able to significantly change this. But right now, you know, we are weak. They don't have to try as hard to disrupt us. And as far as the libertarians, who I also mentioned, I'd be remiss not to follow up. Their domain seems to be more influence than power. You see a few libertarians get elected here and there to like a state legislature, and then you got Rand Paul, who, I mean, even is in the Republican Party. The neoliberal consensus, largely shaped by libertarian thought, I would say. However, as far as them taking power as an independent force, this is not something we have seen to date. So, and to be honest, my blood runs a little bit cold at the idea of those just complete know-nothing lunatics. I mean, the Tea Party was bad enough. Anybody who, you know, has closely observed the effects of a state run by a Tea Party legislature or governor or something like that, just, they're insane. I mean, they're really crazy. So these are the berserkers and the shock troops that the Republican Party decided to roll out after they had expended all their credibility on Bush, Cheney, and the 2008 crash and bailout. And, you know, these are the shock troops of, you know, right-wing populism here in the United States. All right, continuing. When we compare the fascist program with its fulfillment, we can foresee already today the complete ideological collapse of fascism in Italy. Political bankruptcy must inevitably follow in the wake of this ideological bankruptcy. Fascism is unable to keep together the forces which helped it to get into power. A clash of interests in many forms is already making itself felt. Fascism has not yet succeeded in making the old bureaucracy subservient to it. In the army, there is also friction between the old officers and the new fascist leaders. The differences between the various political parties are growing. Resistance against fascism is increasing throughout the country. Class antagonism begins to permeate even the ranks of the fascists. The fascists are unable to keep the promises which they made to the workers and to the fascist trade unions. Wage reductions and dismissals of workers are the order of the day. Thus it happens that the first protest against the fascist trade union movement came from the ranks of the fascists themselves. The workers will very soon come back to their class interest and class duty. We must not look upon fascism as a united force capable of repelling our attack. It is rather a formation which comprises many antagonistic elements and will be disintegrated from within. But it would be dangerous to assume that the ideological and political disintegration of fascism in Italy would be immediately followed by military disintegration. On the contrary, we must be prepared for fascism to endeavor to keep alive by terrorist methods. Therefore, the revolutionary Italian workers must be prepared for further serious struggles. It would be a great calamity if we were satisfied with the role of spectators of this process of disintegration. It is our duty to hasten this process with all the means at our disposal. This is not only the duty of the Italian proletariat, but also the duty of the German proletariat in the face of German fascism. After Italy, fascism is strongest in Germany. As a consequence of the result of the war and of the failure of the revolution, the capitalist economy of Germany is weak, and in no other country is the contrast between the objective ripeness for revolution and the subjective unpreparedness of the working class as great as just now in Germany. In no other country have the reformists so ignominiously failed as in Germany. Their failure is more criminal than the failure of any other party in the old international, because it is they who should have conducted the struggle for the emancipation of the proletariat with utterly different means in the country where the working class organizations are older and better organized than anywhere else. comment. Again, some real shades of U.S. politics here. There are differences. The trade unions have been dismantled. We don't have strong worker organizations. That is what we are hopefully in the process of trying to build up over the next 10 years. When I use that hashtag Revolution 2030 or Rev 2030, that's the idea I'm trying to express, is this sort of blossoming reemergence of Marxist thought, hopefully free of a lot of the squabbles of the past. We need to stay focused on the present, obviously learning from history. But anyway, that is one difference. Another one is that the United States, revolutionary situations here. We obviously have extreme inequality. Things are really worsening by the day as far as the instability of the economy, opportunities for people, the housing market. I mean, just really, really basic life, trying to get things done, is becoming a near impossibility for many people. However, the United States has been strong in terms of its image, in terms of its prestige for a long time. They were riding that, being co-winner of World War II for forever. They have ridden that for all it's worth, and that contributed to its strength as far as being virtually unassailable from a kind of, socialist, revolutionary perspective. There just was too much support there. Morale was too high within the empire, etc. We're certainly, I think, facing a situation where that is in sharp decline. How long it will take to actually get to a point where we socialists can do something real with it, I don't have a crystal ball. Again, fingers crossed and working hard for Rev 2030, hoping that in the next 10 years, if we really push, we will gain control of this conversation among disaffected U.S. workers. That is the goal. Continuing with the text. I am firmly convinced that neither the peace treaties after World War I nor the occupation of the Ruhr have given such a fillip to fascism in Germany as the seizure of power by Mussolini. This has encouraged the German fascists. The collapse of fascism in Italy would greatly discourage the fascists in Germany. Comment, obviously, of course, we know how this one turned out, and unfortunately, fascism certainly got developed in Germany, all right. Continuing. We must not overlook one thing. The prerequisite for the overthrow of fascism abroad is the overthrow of fascism in every single country by the proletariat of these countries. It behooves us to overcome fascism ideologically and politically. This imposes enormous tasks on us. We must realize that fascism is a movement of the disappointed and of those whose existence is ruined. Therefore, we must endeavor either to win over or to neutralize those wide masses who are still in the fascist camp. I wish to emphasize the importance of our realizing that we must struggle ideologically for the possession of the soul of these masses. We must realize that they are not only trying to escape from their present tribulations, but that they are longing for a new philosophy. We must come out of the narrow limits of our present activity. The Third International is, in contradistinction to the Old International, an international of all races without any distinctions whatsoever. The communist parties must not only be the vanguard of the proletarian manual workers, but also the energetic defenders of the interests of the brain workers. They must be the leaders of all sections of society which are driven into opposition to bourgeois domination because of their interests and their expectations of the future. Therefore, I welcomed the proposal of Comrade Zinoviev, speaking at a session of the enlarged Executive Committee of the Communist International in June of this year, to take up the struggle for the workers' and peasants' government. I was jubilant when I read about it. This new slogan has a great significance for all countries. We cannot dispense with it in the struggle for the overthrow of fascism. It means that the salvation of the wide masses of the small peasantry will be achieved through communism. We must not limit ourselves merely to carrying on a struggle for our political and economic program. We must at the same time familiarize the masses with the ideals of communism as a philosophy. If we do this, we shall show the way to a new philosophy, to all those elements which have lost their bearings, during the historical development of recent times. The necessary prerequisite for this is that as we approach these masses, we also become organizationally, as a party, a firmly welded unit. If we do not do that, we run the risk of falling into opportunism and of going bankrupt. We must adapt our methods of work to our new task. We must speak to the masses in a language which they can understand without doing prejudice to our ideas. Thus, the struggle against fascism brings forward a number of new tasks. It behooves all the parties to carry out this task energetically and in conformity with the situation in their respective countries. However, we must bear in mind that it is not enough to overcome fascism ideologically and politically. The position of the proletariat as regards fascism is at present one of self-defense. This self-defense of the proletariat must take the form of a struggle for its existence and its organization. The proletariat must have a well-organized apparatus of self-defense. Whenever fascism uses violence, it must be met with proletarian violence. I do not mean by this individual terrorist acts, but the violence of the organized revolutionary class struggle of the proletariat. Germany has made a beginning by organizing factory hundreds. This struggle can only be successful if there is a proletarian united front. The workers must unite for the struggle regardless of party. The self-defense of the proletariat is one of the greatest incentives for the establishment of the proletarian united front. Only by instilling class consciousness into the soul of every worker will we succeed in preparing also for the military overthrow of fascism, which at this juncture is absolutely necessary. If we succeed in this, we may be sure that it will be soon all up with the capitalist system and with bourgeois power, regardless of any success of the general offensive of the bourgeoisie against the proletariat. The signs of disintegration, which are so palpably before our eyes, give us the conviction that the giant proletariat will again join in the revolutionary fray, and that its call to the bourgeois world will be, "I am the strength, I am the will, in me you see the future." And that's the end of the audiobook. So I have a few additional comments before we close this out. As usual, I welcome your comments in the comment section below. So I have run afoul of various, quote, socialists in the YouTube online world for saying that we should not be looking to work with libertarians and other right-wing populists, pseudo-populists, however you want to phrase it. I stand by that. I believe that this document says exactly what I have been saying all along. When we try to reach out to disaffected people, yeah, that's absolutely what I've been saying this whole time. Like, you reach out to people who are disaffected and who, people you can agitate, basically. I mean, what is agitation? It's drawing out people's complaints and concerns. It's helping people articulate and own that alienation, that upset, those disappointments, that unrest. Okay? Then we educate, and then we organize. That's how it works. Okay. My problem has been more with people who seem to be proposing a merger or an embrace of right-wing populism, which absolutely means abandoning our position. To the extent that someone is not doing this, I probably don't have any complaint with you, because that is the primary complaint. What I'm saying is, when people go and propose a left-right alliance, no. That means you're embracing the right wing. I mean, ideologically. You can't do that. We want opposite things, and any embrace of that is going to lead us astray. You want to convert them to left-wing thinking. That's the idea. Okay? We want to make disaffected people into socialists. If they are not socialists or socialist sympathetic, then they're of no use to us. In fact, they're probably going to be more than obstacles. They will be enemies, which is what right-wing ideology seeks to do to workers. I honestly don't know how anyone can possibly be confused about that, which is why I tend to see disagreement on this issue as not being in particularly good faith. I don't think it's honest at all. This idea that, example, when Zetkin says at the end that there needs to be a united front and that the workers must unite for this struggle regardless of party, she obviously doesn't mean the fucking fascist party. Obviously. It means that we can't fall into sectarianism in opposing this, for starters. But it does not mean, embracing fascists somehow. That sort of defeats the entire point of opposing it. The two are not compatible ideas. They're fundamentally contradictory. It's not possible to do both. So I know that discussion has not been terminated and it is still ongoing. To the extent that people really need this explained, I'm happy to continue this discussion. But increasingly, I feel like I said, it's not happening in good faith. I don't understand how you could be honestly confused. And in fact, most of the disagreement I get tends to be very pointed, very hostile, very much, personal attacks and not requests for clarification or, hey, I'm confused. They are slams. They're very aggressive. And that is, trying to just shut me down. To which I say, go fuck yourself. Because I'm not going for that. We are not going for that. Everybody else who is onto this, I don't see it. I had a mod on Reddit recently tell me, we need a populist socialism. I responded by saying, what is a populist socialism to you and why do we need it? And I never got a response. Most populism in the 20th century is anti-communist in nature. It was one thing in the 19th century, 1870s, 80s, 90s. To be a populist, socialism wasn't as widely discussed and debated. Also, the class composition of the country was different. The proletariat was smaller. Many more people were farmers. It was just, capitalism wasn't as advanced. The proletariat was a smaller class. I mean, it's like you see in the Soviet Union. They had an alliance between workers and peasants because capitalism wasn't as advanced. It was one of those backward countries. There was still a ton of peasants in the rural areas. So to have any kind of a socialist progressive alliance, you had to make that alliance. Today in the United States, the proletariat is 90% of the country. It's not the same anymore. You don't, and again, a worker-peasant alliance is not the same as a left-right alliance. Those aren't the same things. Reaction and progress are not the same things. Capital and labor, not the same things. And I find all too quickly this very dubious left-right alliance concept gets us into this territory of compromising the fundamental distinctive features that define us as communists. I'm not talking about ornamental differences. I'm talking about the basic premises of what it means to be a Marxist. If you give that up, you have walked away from socialism. It's that simple. So I expect that this conversation will go on for some time, and I'm willing to have it to the extent that this helps the movement. But I am wary, and I encourage you as well to be wary of people who just seem to bend over backwards to try to get you to embrace right-wing ideologies and the people who follow them for the shakiest of reasons. Fighting fascism ideologically does not mean embracing anyone who claims to be upset or disappointed with the status quo, doesn't like the establishment, whatever. They are not your automatic ally. They are a potential ally after a conversation and maybe a conversion process, depending on where their head is at. But it's not automatic. All right. I think we've said enough on that. Thanks for listening. Thanks to our current patrons whose names are on the screen. If you want to support, head to patreon.com/socialismforall. You can sign up for as little as $2 a month. If that's not your thing, sharing the videos is a huge help, particularly on Facebook, where we have no presence currently. There are a lot of left-wing, socialist, Marxist groups on Facebook with hundreds or thousands of people who are self-identified as being interested. Go share the videos with them. Always worked well in the past. If that's not your thing, liking, commenting, subscribing, all of those help to boost the channel as well. And please note, we're now on Twitter at twitter.com/socialisms4a. Thanks again for listening. We'll catch you in the next video.